Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. On today's video, I want to answer the question as to, can we use gluten-free bread in Holy Communion? Now, I've actually written a paper titled Holy Communion and Gluten-Free Bread. You can find this on the COELC website, coelc.org, and head over to the resources tab and you'll find papers by Pastor or Reverend Jake Zabel, I think is what it's called, and you'll find my paper there. Now for this video I'm going to basically kind of go through this paper, but the paper's a bit lengthy and it's got a lot more detail and I would rather people go and read the full paper there, and I'm going to try and skip through this and basically give a summary in this video. Essentially, the Church holds that for communion to be valid, there has to be natural bread and natural wine. Now this is why in the COELC we don't support the idea of using grape juice or non-alcoholic wine in Holy Communion, because that is not natural wine. When it comes to the question as to what is natural bread, this is really where the question arises regarding gluten-free bread, because what is natural bread? Now, the Roman Catholics actually reject the use of anything other than wheat bread. It must be bread made with wheat, otherwise it is not considered valid bread in the Roman Catholics. But in this video, I'm going to discuss, is that actually how the Jews and the early Christians and the early Lutherans considered the topic of bread? Is bread limited only to wheat bread? Ask, what is bread? Now, I can give you the dictionary definition, which is that it's food made from flour, water, and yeast mixed together and baked. And then if you want to find out what is the definition of flour, it's ground up grains. And now grains here can include everything from wheat, spelt, rye, barley, sorghum, and even corn, rice, oats, all of those. They're all considered as grains that can be used to make flour, and from there used to make bread. And for those people who use gluten-free stuff, they'll know that corn flour or rice flour are some of the most common flours used to make gluten-free stuff, particularly gluten-free bread. But is rice flour and corn flour considered to be proper flour? And would bread made from rice flour be considered valid bread? Well, we really need to actually look at what is bread, because actually, if you look up flour, you can have like banana bread. It's made from like banana flour and stuff like that. Even dehydrated potatoes or dehydrated fish can be used to make flour and then make bread. So the real question is, what is natural bread? Because normally you wouldn't make bread from bananas, fish, or potatoes. So the real question is, what do we consider valid natural bread? Well, to understand this, we really need to look at what the Bible refers to as bread. So in the Old Testament, there are 4 different words used for the word bread. There is uga, which refers to a cake or a loaf of bread. It actually comes from the word meaning to bake. There is also chorai, which is essentially the Hebrew word for white bread. It actually comes from the word chava, meaning white. There is matzah bread. That's the name of the type of unleavened bread used for the Passover. But then the most common word used for bread throughout the Bible is the word lechem, which is also, it's just a word meaning food. It's derived from the word lacham, meaning to eat. But it's the most common word used for bread in the Old Testament. And it's normally used in regards to wheat bread, but it's not limited to references of wheat bread. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 4 verse 9, the prophet is commanded to make bread, lechem, using wheat, barley, and spelt, sometimes rye, depending on your translations. And also in the book of Judges, chapter 7 verse 13, there's a loaf of barley bread, barley lechem, that tumbles into the Midian camp. So from the Old Testament, the word lechem is used in reference to wheat, barley, spelt, and even rye. Now, this is important when we start looking at the New Testament, because in the New Testament, there are actually also 4 words used for bread. There is prosthesis, which is the word used for the showbread used in the temple. There is the word koleron, which refers to like a roll or a loaf of bread. There is the word azumos. That is the Greek version of the word matzah. It's the unleavened bread used for the Passover. And then there is the Greek word atos, which is the Greek version of the Hebrew lachem. Again, it's most commonly used for bread, but it can also just generically mean food. And it's important here because the word atos is the one that is used during the institution of the Lord's Supper. In the words of institution, Jesus took atos bread. He didn't take azumos, leavened bread. He actually took atos bread. Now that could be leavened bread, but it could be unleavened bread. That is another question about the idea of whether the Passover Seder and this is a question about whether the Last Supper was a Passover Seder. That's a video for another time. Pastor Magnus knows a lot more on that. I'd rather leave that topic for a video for him to do. But the word atos bread is used for the bread used for the Holy Communion. And this word atos is used in John 6, 9 and 13 for barley bread, which is what Jesus uses for the feeding of the 5,000, which itself is kind of a archetype or a symbol of Holy Communion. Now, what happens at the feeding of the 5,000 is not one-to-one with Holy Communion, but it does serve as kind of a archetype to Holy Communion, and Jesus there uses barley bread. We can also see that the word bread or atos is not limited to wheat in Roman culture. In fact, the Romans and the Greeks used the word atos to refer to bread made from wheat, bread made from barley, bread made from spelt, bread made from rye, and yes, even bread made from oats. So those 5 grains are actually important because they're going to come up again in the next section that I've got here. Because when it comes to the question of Holy Communion and the Passover Seder, what bread did the Jews use for Passover? Now, as I mentioned, there is some question as to whether the Last Supper was a Passover Seder and whether Jesus was using unleavened bread during Holy Communion or whether he was using regular bread from a regular feast. That's a topic for another day. I'll let Pastor Magnus answer that one. But many scholars, even Martin Luther himself, believed that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder and that the bread that Jesus was using was unleavened bread. It's actually for this reason that the Roman Catholics and other churches like the Byzantine Rite of the Eastern Catholic churches, the Syro-Melbar Church and the Maronite Church, they all command that we must use unleavened bread because Jesus used unleavened bread during the institution. Churches like the Eastern Orthodox use leavened bread, and Lutherans actually have that as an open question, but the Catholics insist on using unleavened bread. Now, the Catholics also insisted that we must use wheat bread. But here's the problem. The Catholics say that we must have unleavened bread because that's what the Jews used during Passover. Yet, the Jews did not limit the Passover bread to just wheat bread like the Catholics do. In fact, in Jewish tradition, there are 5 different grains that are permitted for use in the Passover Seder. There is some disagreement over exactly what those grains were. Some say spelt, some say rye, some say barley, some say oats, some say farro, some say sorghum, some say some other type of wheat, some say some other type of barley. There's actually disagreement amongst the Jews as to what exactly these 5 grains are. But the most commonly accepted view is that the 5 grains permitted for the Passover Seder are wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. And that's the position of the Orthodox Jewish kind of denomination within Judaism. The Orthodox Jews officially permit wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats for the use in Passover bread. And that is interesting because, as I mentioned above, those are the 5 grains used in the Roman Empire to make bread. They were the 5 types of grains that were used to make atos bread. And so the question then is, are any of these grains gluten-free? Well, wheat definitely isn't gluten-free, barley isn't gluten-free, rye isn't gluten-free, and spelt isn't gluten-free. But as for oats, they are actually gluten-free. See, oats if they are non-contaminated, pure oats, they are gluten-free. Most oats are safe for use for people who are gluten intolerant. They're just generally not used for people who are celiac because most places that grow and sell oats grow them alongside wheat, barley and rye, and so there is some cross-contamination, and that kind of makes the oats unsafe for celiacs, but generally safe for people who are just gluten intolerant. But you can get pure oats that are gluten-free, and if you make flour from pure oats, that is a gluten-free flour, and thus you can make a gluten-free bread. In fact, in Jewish communities, if a person is gluten intolerant or celiac, they will use a Passover bread made from gluten-free oat flour. And so, in summary, the question is, can we use gluten-free bread in Holy Communion? Well, the Bible does not limit the word bread to just wheat breads. The Bible uses the term bread in reference to other types of bread, such as barley, rye, and spelt. And in the Greco-Roman Empire, they did also use the word bread in reference to breads made from oats. And the Jews did permit those 5 types of grain to be used in the Passover bread. So, based on all that, I don't see why we should limit communion bread just to wheat bread. As long as it is valid bread made from grains, I do not see an issue. I don't think we can necessarily make a hard and fast rule that you can't have gluten-free bread made from rice flour. Just based on what I've read here in this article and in my own research, if I was to use gluten-free bread, I would probably prefer to follow the traditions of the Jews here and go, we will use oats because that is something that was used at the time of Christ to make bread. So I would prefer to use bread made from oat flour rather than rice flour if I was going to make gluten-free bread, just because it kind of does away with any questionings. Like, is rice valid? I don't see why not, but some people may doubt. So let's go with oats. I mean, personally, in my congregation, because we have people who are gluten intolerant, not celiac, thank God, but they are gluten intolerant. And so for communion, I will tend to actually use low gluten bread, which is made from wheat starch. And this is actually bread that actually comes from a Catholic site. It's actually from Catholic Church resources. This is the same bread that is used in Catholic churches for either gluten intolerant or celiac members in the Roman Catholic Church. It is a wheat bread. It's made from wheat starch and it has low gluten. They can't officially say it's got no gluten, but it does seem to be it does seem to be safe for people who are gluten intolerant and also celiac safe. I do know people who are Catholic and celiacs who do consume this low gluten bread during Holy Communion. So it is something that is permitted in the Catholic Church. Now again, as I pointed in my video, I'm not making a hard and fast rule that we must only ever use wheat bread. I'd be fine using gluten-free bread made from oat flour. But just for the sake of people's consciences, I would prefer to use this low gluten bread that is still made from wheat and is also used within the Roman Catholic Church, just for the sake of people's consciences. So if I have members come into my church who go, oh, well, this can't be real communion because it's not made using wheat bread, just to ease their consciences, I'd be happy to use gluten-free bread made from oat flour, but for the sake of consciences, I prefer to use this wheat starch bread. But before I wrap up this video, just to show that this isn't just Pastor Jake's opinion, or that the coelc is somehow unusual on this view regarding the different types of grains in bread, I have 2 quotes that I would like to read to you. The first comes from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's 1983 statement, Theology and Practice of the Lord's Supper. In it, the Missouri Synod writes that since the scriptures are silent on the source of bread, it may be baked from the flour of wheat, rye, barley, or other grains. Other grains, including oats. So the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, at least as of the 1980s does permit the use of bread made from grains other than wheat, and they would permit the use of bread made from grains that are gluten-free. We also have the Lutheran theologian from the 1800s, Heinrich Schmid, in his The Doctrinal Theology of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. In it, he quotes the older Lutheran theologian David Hollatz, who I believe kind of existed in the 1600s Pietist era, but Hollatz wrote that the terrestrial matter of the Lord's Supper is partly bread, in regards to its substance genuine. It is not important, however, in regards to its quantity, whether it be more or less, or whether it be round or oblong, in regards to its quality, whether it be fermented or unfermented, in regards to the kind of grain, whether it be wheat, rye, or barley. So actually, as of probably the 1700s, Lutherans already took this position that communion bread did not have to be limited to just bread made from wheat. It could be bread made from other grains, as long as it is valid natural bread. And that is defined as bread that is made from flour. And that flour then has to be something that is made from ground up grains. Now, some people may question whether rice is or isn't a grain, and so for that sake, I would say it's best probably to avoid breads made from rice flour. But at the time of Christ, the Greco-Romans used bread, and they called it bread made from oat flour. And pure, uncontaminated oat flour is gluten-free. And so, I do believe that we in the church can have bread made from gluten-free flour. I hope that answers your question. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye, and God bless.